Dear esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, the theme of this year's Kulturalta talks is the future. Tomorrow we will be pondering the future of Finland, but our opening panel deals with the future of European security institutions. You're warmly welcome. At the heart of European integration lies a paradox. The European project was born out of war, and it was intended to ensure peace on the continent. But it was meant to do so without an explicit mandate to discuss, let alone act, on the topic. Yet the question of European security, even common defense, has never been far from the surface. Soon after the Schuman Declaration on May 9, 1950, the Pleven Plan for European Defence Community was mooted and quickly abandoned. Since then, the Europeans have taken repeated bites out of the forbidden fruit of European defence. In the process, the fruit has become less forbidden, and the need to act together in the field of security more pressing. The Helsinki headline goals of 1999 were an important milestone in launching the EU as a security actor. Yet, for all intents and purposes, the EU in a way still outsources its security. There are good reasons for this, and hardly anyone would question the key arrangements. At the same time, it's becoming increasingly clear that we, as Europeans, have to devote more attention to our own security. One should be very clear about what we mean by the terms. When we are talking about European defense cooperation, we are not talking about collective defense. At least not yet. That is still the remit of NATO. But under the banner of protecting Europe, we are increasingly asking ourselves what more we can and must do together on the European level to better protect our citizens' common interests and values. For me, the issue boils down to this. Any union worthy of the name must play its full share in ensuring the security of its citizens. This might, in due course, entail common European defense. But we are not there yet. For the moment, we have more questions than answers. How do we share the responsibilities between the EU and NATO? What can those two do better together, and what must be done separately? How much we Europeans must be willing to contribute to our own security, and how best to organize it? Do we all agree what the key threats are and how best to respond to them? And how do we interpret the Article 42.7 of the Treaty of Lisbon? Finland's approach is very straightforward. We see a lot of untapped potential in EU defense cooperation. We view the EU as a security community that is built on solidarity and mutual dependence. We want the EU to be ambitious, but at the same time, we believe that taking small and concrete steps is the best way forward. We want the future arrangements to be open and inclusive, but not to the point of the lowest common denominator. And finally, we want to help the EU and NATO to work better together to ensure an interlocking and not an interblocking system of security in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, the Kulturalta Talks is a forum for open exchange and debate. I trust the spirit of Kulturalta will guide our discussions, and I warmly welcome you all once again. I also want to thank our distinguished international guests for accepting my invitation. The title of our opening panel has never been more timely or topical. Now, I want to invite the moderator of the opening session, Monsieur François HEISBOURG, on the stage. He is the chairman of the IISS and the Geneva Center for Security Policy and a special advisor of the Paris-based Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique. He is a great friend of Finland and one of the foremost experts on the topic of the day. He is uniquely qualified to introduce and moderate our opening debate. François, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, dear friends, it's a really great pleasure to be here today. It's an honor and a pleasure, I should say. It's an honor to be in this remarkable country, 100 years of independence in its modern form. A country which indeed I have enormous respect and, if I may say so, affection for. There's a combination of freedom and seriousness about security in Finland, which speaks to my strategic heart, if I can put it that way. And it's also good to see a number of other friends in this room, including one of the other four horsemen of the apocalypse who drafted the NATO assessment here in Finland last year. What I will do now is to call to the stage the participants in this panel. I will say a few words of introduction and of course introduce them. There will be some questions which I will put to the panelists, and once we have done that stage, and provided that we have time, and I think we will, I would like to open up the floor to the discussion as well. Madame Mogherini, dear Børge BRENDE, Rose GOTTEMOELLER, if you want to join, that would be great. Rose, why don't you come over here? Voilà. Sit whichever way pleases you the most. Voilà. Børge. Voilà. Voilà, thank you very much indeed. I'm not going to make any long introductory remarks. We all have in mind the extraordinary 12 months which have elapsed since the last meeting here in Kulturalta. We've had Brexit, in a way reshaping, we don't know how, but it surely will reshape the European Union with Brexit. We have had the election of Mr. Trump, who may reshape the entire alliance system, if not international relations more broadly, because he is the President of the United States and the Commander-in-Chief. He knows that. We sometimes do not. We have to assume that he is. And we've had, just as incredibly in terms of the political probabilities at the beginning of the process, we've had the election of a young new president in France, Monsieur Macron, coming out of the blue, if I can put it that way, with potentially very far-reaching impact also here in Europe. The last 12 months have not been good in terms of the evolution of the threat situation. The Middle East is plunged into the equivalent of the 30 Years' War, and it certainly isn't getting any better. Who would have expected 2 weeks ago that there would be an Iranian airlift to Qatar as I speak? It's quite extraordinary. To the east, our Russian friends continue to entertain their revisionist vision of what the post-Cold War order should look like. Terrorism, of course, is part and parcel of the concerns of our citizens and of our governments. This is quite an extraordinary global situation in which to find ourselves, and a European situation. And I would add, because sometimes I come across as a pessimist, not out of inclination, I would add, it's usually because the situation warrants the pessimism, but there actually is, and not simply here today, some blue sky out there as well. The prospects for the European Union in economic, social and political terms, I think, are actually rather better than they appeared to be last year. To talk about these issues, we have our three panelists. I will obviously not read through their resume. You know who they are. But I would simply want to point out a few things which maybe get lost in the noise. Well, the first one definitely does not get lost in the noise because it's fairly obvious and apparent. These are three young people. When I say young people, that means they're younger than I am. And indeed, they are young people, but they're people of immense experience. Federica Mogherini, we, of course, know what you are doing. We know where you come from, but a number of us may have forgotten that you have also had NATO experience as the head of the Italian delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And this is something which, once again, may not be absolutely obvious to many people. Dear Børge, BRENDE, you, of course, have been in politics practically when you left grade school. But here again, there are things which are not so obvious. Alongside your very rich and varied political career, you have also had very substantial involvement in business and charity. And this is also something which people may want to bear in mind. And Rose, of course, as the chairman of the IISS in London, I remember fondly a certain deputy director at the IISS some time ago was called Rose GOTTEMOELLER, which is another way of saying that alongside her accomplishments in administration, where she has been in charge of, to put it in broad brush terms, of non-proliferation policy, arms control policy at the Department of Energy, at the Department of State. She's also had an incredibly rich and diverse career in the think tank world. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where you are not simply running the non-proliferation program, you are also running the Moscow Center at one stage. It's quite interesting. You were involved with RAND. You were involved with the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, I will ask the same question of all three of you, going in the, and I would ask you to answer in the order in which I introduced you. The same question to all of you before I get into specific questions. And that question is, how did you react when you heard the statement by Angela Merkel that we in Europe, I quote, must take our fate into our own hands, end of quote. And she said this shortly and pointedly after the recent NATO and G7 heads of state and government meetings. So Federica Mogherini, why don't you?
Well, I didn't react in any particular manner, if you allow me to be sincere. simply because this is a fundamental truth since quite some time now. And those in the room that have followed developments over these last 12 months on the European Union security, defense, and also foreign policy know very well. We started to deepen and make concrete work on the European defense exactly 1 year ago when I presented the global strategy, right in the same days of the UK referendum, but the indication of direction was taken before knowing the results. And the implementation of it is taking place still at 28 by unanimity. Timo, that I would like to thank here publicly for an excellent work and support we are doing together in this, is witness to that. All the decisions we have taken in this last 12 months have been unanimous, and also thanks to an excellent Finnish contribution. And well before the election of Trump to the White House. This to say that if we are taking our destiny into our hands, this is because we feel this is the right thing to do for ourselves, not because someone is asking for that, or not because we see more unpredictability around us, which is, by the way, true. But the decision was taken before. I believe this is a good thing for Europeans. I think this is also a good thing for the rest of the world, because, and I'll stop here because I think it's much more interesting to have an open conversation and debate, but I'm seeing in these months an incredible demand for Europe in the world in terms of having a credible, reliable, strong multilateral partner, both on development, on humanitarian, but also on trade, on climate change, and on defense and security. From China to Japan to Chile to Africa, being it in the Horn of Africa or in the Sahel, there's an incredible demand for partnering with Europe, including on security and defense. And I do not mention the Middle East simply because this is quite obvious. Sure. So I think this is going to be good for Europeans. This is going to be good for our partners, including NATO. And indeed, you highlighted one of my backgrounds, which maybe is the reason why we've never had such a wonderful partnership between the European Union and NATO, because somehow we crossed our destinies personally and from a professional point of view. So I didn't have any particular reaction to that sentence because it sounded quite familiar to me, even in the months before.
Interesting. Børge.
So that speech of Chancellor Merkel also took place in a tent. Yep. But it was more than water in that tent. I think there was a CSU happening with some beer. I think the president will be serving that maybe later on. But
she wasn't drinking.
No. So I think she's very serious, the chancellor. And what she said, I agree with what Federica said. In reality, if the timing had been a little bit different, would be stating the obvious that Europe needs to take more responsibility for our own security. And I think we're up to it, and we need to do this. And that is also the result of the Wales meeting in NATO. We have committed to reach the 2% target. And you know, if Germany is going to increase from 1% to 2%, we will see a Germany with military capacity in Europe almost the size of Russia. I think we also will have to bring that into the equation. When it comes to my country, Norway, we have very strong security ties with the US and will continue to have so. The reality is that the US is more than 50% of the global military capacity, and it will continue to be so, and also with the program that President Trump has now put forward, together with Secretary Mattis, it will still be a major force. But what we are seeing in Europe, and there I do agree with the Chancellor, is that there can be also security threats in Europe that are different from what is on the top of the agenda in DC. There is an Atlantic Ocean, geographically I mean, between the US and the migration pressure that we are seeing, that we only have seen the top of the iceberg related to. It is Atlantic Ocean between the US and ISIL and violent extremism. It is Atlantic Ocean between the US and Finland's and Norway's common neighbor in the east. So on those issues, we have to do more. That's why we're also stepping up our military capacities. We will reach the 2% goal. In my country, we're investing more than 30% of our defense budget now in modern equipment, military-wise.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Rose.
It won't surprise you, François, I'm going to answer this question with my institutional hat on. You said yourself that we have faced an extraordinarily up and down roller coaster ride over the past 12 months in terms of political developments. And I think even over the past few days, we've seen that continue, that extraordinary roller coaster ride, juxtaposed against a truly extraordinary threat environment that is, I would say, qualitatively different since 2014, since we saw Russia seize Ukrainian territory in the Crimea, and we also in that year saw the rise of Daesh and the seizure of Mosul. So for a while, NATO, the defense and security alliance in Europe, but also the Transatlantic Alliance with membership in the United States and Canada as well, has been having to be the steadfast soldier. And so no matter what is going on in the cycles of the political discourse, we have to bear in mind that extraordinary threat environment and keep our eyes on the prize of greater security for all of our members. And so I would say that inside the NATO alliance, we had that reaction, and it was that, and by the way, it was the reaction to all of the discussions that went on through the period of May 25 and its aftermath. We're approaching our defense ministerial on the 29th of June, where we'll have a great deal of serious discussion about how we do keep our eye on the prize and how we continue to provide for the defense and security of the alliance, but also how we continue to up our game in terms of cooperation with the European Union. And I agree with everything Federica said in terms of the reality of our interconnectedness now. It's truly turning into an extraordinary cooperation between two great institutions. So I think that we need to do what NATO does best and continue to hone our capability to deliver on defense and security and not allow, the conversations on the outside to be too distracting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, since you do come as a citizen from the United States of America, and since your president is President Trump, I think I would want to put a specific question on that to you. And I know that you have your institutional constraints, but try to lay them to the side to the extent that you can. And I know it's not easy. President Trump and candidate Trump, and even Donald Trump before he was candidate, was very clear that international relations from his standpoint were essentially transactional and essentially bilateral. There's no place for multilateralism because multilateralism dilutes the balance of power when you are the powerful one. And transactional means that you actually treat your friends or supposed friends just about the same that you would treat your enemies. That is, you do a deal, you cut a deal. He has applied that Weltanschauung, because I think it is a Weltanschauung. This is serious, this is very consistent. This is not something he came up with on, in the middle of a meeting in Wisconsin. This is something which he has been saying for about 15, 16 years. If that is the case, and if Mr. Trump fulfills his full presidential term, and I think that must be the working assumption, that he will do so, that is what he was elected for in the framework of the American democratic process, in effect, will it be possible after those 4 years to revert to the norm of the last 70 years, which is that of an alliance system which was designed to be enduring and to be unconditional. All for one, one for all, the uniqueness of NATO. Remember all of those words that we have been using, and rightly so, to describe the unique quality of the alliance. If the alliance becomes transactional, like other facets of international relations, in effect, we would be dropping the norm of the last 70 years and reverting to the pre-World War II norms. That of fungible, conditional, transactional alliances or absence of alliances. And if we go back to that default mode, will it be possible to move back from the old default mode to the exceptional system which we created after the Second World War because the conditions existed in which we could create it? Rose.
Well, let me begin with Mr. Trump. Of course, he is a businessman, and his experience coming into the White House has been formed at the deal-making table. There's no question about that, and I think it is a reality of the situation that we should think about in terms of what advantages may accrue from it. There's a very good Atlantic article out there that I commend to you. You've probably already read it, François, that talks about the way in which Mr. Trump's attention to the burden-sharing issue has finally caught the attention of leaders across the NATO alliance. Now, at NATO, we see the new attention to burden-sharing emanating from that important watershed year of 2014, when, in fact, new threats raised their heads in Europe and in the Middle East. So the turnaround began, in our view, at the Wales Summit, and the evidence is there as well, that the numbers started to change. The cuts stopped across the NATO alliance defense budgets, and the numbers began to rise from the red into the blue, as we say, with a big jump in 2016, the year of the Warsaw Summit. So the process had begun, but I do believe that Mr. Trump, in putting new attention on the necessity of fair burden sharing, has really caught the attention of NATO leaders, and that's important. So let me just hazard an hypothesis. And many of you around the room know that I worked for President Clinton, President Obama. My party affiliation is the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party. But let me just put forward an hypothesis that the multilateral institutions, many of us have been somewhat wringing our hands for years now and saying that they need reform. In some cases, they need trimming, they need restructuring, they need fixing in some ways. I'm not talking about the EU here, but you can imagine there are some examples out there. So is it not possible that Mr. Trump, with his tough critique for these organizations, could do some good in terms of getting them to really reform and restructure? Let's just consider that hypothesis. I think it is possible, and certainly I've seen some benefits in the way he's turned up the volume on burden sharing at NATO. Of course, otherwise NATO is perfect, so we need no restructuring or reform. No, I'm joking, of course. NATO is always adapting itself and truly always attentive to the necessity of adaptation. But I don't buy into this hypothesis that somehow we are on the cusp of total abandonment of the post-World War II system, because it's been too powerful and it too much stands for the rule of law today. And so we simply cannot set it aside, and it will not be set aside because it underpins so much of international policy making today.
If I may, Rose, before I turn to Federica, an interesting thing happened in the French presidential election, and that is that every major candidate, apart from the extreme left candidate, it was in favor of going to 2% of GDP on defense, and in the case of Marine Le Pen, actually to 3%. These very different candidates were doing this not because they want to please Mr. Trump. They were doing this because they were assuming, A, that the threat situation was getting worse, what you were saying, it's absolutely true, but also that the alliance relations were going to get weaker, and that therefore we had to hedge against the weakening of the alliance relationship. That, for example, doing European defense, and that is where I'm going to turn to Federica, is going to cost money. It was an interesting point in the election. I don't know.
It's very French.
Yeah, it's very French. It's very French. But it was all candidates, as I said, except one. So Federica, you mentioned the strategy report, which came out, which was rolled out the day after the Brexit referendum last year, which was drafted before Brexit, when most people were not assuming that there would be Brexit, and that if there were Brexit, that Brexit would not be Brexit. It happened, of course, before Trump, and at that stage, nobody that I know thought that Trump had a chance in Hades to win the election. We now see calls from the Commission, Juncker, calls from Mr. Macron, calls, interestingly, not only from Mrs. Merkel, but also from Herr Schäuble, to do more for European defense, to do more financially, to do more institutionally, to do more in terms of capabilities. What is your vision of what European defense should look like? Should it look like a European pillar of NATO, a bit à la Kennedy, which would incidentally resolve one big issue, and that is, where do we put the Brits in all of this, now that they're leaving the European Union? Or do you see it as an extrapolation of what we have been doing for the last years, that is European defense working with an interface with NATO, but being separate and distinct from NATO? But if that European defense becomes the basic hedge against the weakening alliance, and this is what is somehow being hinted at in the French elections, in the German discourse, how do we actually do that? Setting, not even to mention this minor issue which is called Turkey, which has been in effect preventing the interface between NATO and the EU from functioning to its full potential for the last 14 years now. So, what is the vision?
Well, first of all, if I can say one word still on the previous conversation. We are beyond burden sharing. I think we are now at responsibility sharing on security across the Atlantic. And this is why NATO and EU cooperation is so strategically important today. Because there is not one single threat we are facing in our daily life that can be dealt with a purely military approach. And this is the reality of our times. So when European leaders say the Europeans have to take their destiny in their own hands, it doesn't simply mean we have maybe to invest more on defense. This is a national choice that every single country that is member of the NATO alliance will take. This means also that we will have a certain, I'll use a French-liked terminology, we'll have more strategic autonomy in Europe to determine the mix of security approaches that we would like to put in place. Because there is a European way to security. It can be military, but for us, the work on climate change is also part of security. Investment in humanitarian is also part of security. Work on resilience is also part of security. And there will be no one determining our priorities. This is also taking our destiny into our hands. So it's not only about burden sharing in terms of budgets, that is part of it. But it's also a matter of understanding and not being shy on which are the political strategic priorities when it comes to our security. And I will tell you, there is no risk. I will do it in a very confident manner. There is no risk that the multilateral system 4 years down the road will collapse simply because there is the rest of the world, starting from the European Union, that will never, never, never give it up. And that is the new reality maybe of these times. If the climate agreement is put at risk in Washington, you will find the European Union and China and Africa and Latin America and the rest of Asia upholding it. And this is a new reality. And Canada and plenty of businesses and citizens inside different societies that will uphold the UN system, the international agreements, the multilateral framework. So when we talk about taking our destiny into our hands, it also means identifying the top political priorities by ourselves, which is, you know, we turned 60 this year, so we've grown up. We have a lot of, then I'm Italian, my gratitude for the Americans is endless because they liberated our country. And that will stay forever, generation after generation. But we've grown up, and we are big enough, old enough, experienced enough, in the middle of an enough difficult region to understand ourselves what is priority for us to do, also in terms of security, which will start always from the assumption that we're friends across the Atlantic and that we work hand in hand with NATO. But there are some things on which we will take our positions freely. And I think this was also somehow in the words of Chancellor Merkel when she said that, because yes, it's true, she said that sentence after the NATO summit, but most of all, I believe she was coming back from the G7 in Taormina, and that was probably more. But coming to your question, sorry, I didn't want to skip that. I believe the future of the European defense, first of all, is not something abstract and far away. I think the real difference, and the President was mentioning this in his introductory remarks, is that finally, after 60 years of ideological debates about the European defense, we moved into a very pragmatic, step-by-step approach. So we got out of this scenario, future ideological options, and we've started to do the things that the treaties allow us to do on security and defense. The future of it will be determined by the by the mix of ambition and pragmatism that member states will manage to mobilize. What I've seen in this last 10 months, because we've started with the implementation of the strategy in July, so we're almost there, 11 months, and everybody was telling me, you're crazy, because you elaborated a strategy before the British referendum, and let me tell you, we are almost 1 year later, and we have implemented the global strategy on security and defense in 10 different fields that are very concrete actions. And if you look at London, there's a bit of confusion down there. So I think we have to be a bit more self-confident when it comes to our own choices. The future will be, I think, very clear in terms of relations with NATO. Strong partnership, cooperation as the norm, as we are doing now in these last months, but having very clear that the European Union is not turning into a military alliance. We will have to strengthen our military capacity without changing our nature. As the President was very rightly mentioning, there is, I think, only one part of the European treaties where NATO is mentioned, and that is in reference to the collective defense, the territorial defense, which is clearly stated is for the member states that are also NATO allies, responsibility of NATO. So we are not turning into a military alliance, we're not looking at collective territorial defense, we're not developing a European army, we're not doing anything of that. We're simply saying the European Union has the means, including the financial means, to allow member states to do better on defense and security, not only defense and security, with a mix of military and civilian tools, by the way, including on investments, because, and I discussed this several times with our friends in the new US administration, the 2% choice is a national choice of NATO allies. But the real problem of defense investment in Europe is fragmentation. Europe spends or invests 50% of what the Americans invest in defense, 50. The output in terms of capabilities is 15% in Europe. Rose has heard me saying these numbers time and again. This means that the choice of increasing the expenditure is a national choice. It's not for the European Union to work on it, but even keeping the same investment on defense, the way to maximize the output is through European Union facilitated coordination. And that can increase the output of capabilities that are capabilities owned by member states that then can use them in NATO operations, in EU operations, in UN missions, in national or multilateral interventions. So this to say that even with things staying as they are in terms of investments and burden sharing, the way to maximize the effects, the output of the European defense is through European Union cooperation. And this is what we're doing. If you want, I can give you a couple of practical examples of the decisions that are already in place. Or maybe if you want, I can come to back.
Yeah, we may come back to that later. Before I turn to Børge, I'd want Rose to react to the theme that you have just raised about defense investment. The French, or more precisely one particular French person, Thierry Breton, former head of telecom firm, launched the idea a few years ago that we could create a European defense fund which could serve to promote the rationalization of defense acquisition and of the defense industry. But at the time, this did not work out terribly well. The Germans thought it was another clever way of the French to find funding from Germany to make up for their own problems. This was before the 2% pledge, and so on. The atmosphere has changed completely, and the European Defence Fund is part and parcel of the discussions. Federica knows much more about this than I do, the discussions in Brussels, and I would not be surprised if in a few years' time we would have a European Defence Fund of, let's say, 5 billion euro a year. Now, 5 billion doesn't look like very much at the scale of the EU. It's maybe 3% of defense spending of the EU. But when you look at these 5 billion, and you compare them to defense investment, which is, depending on how you count, between 35 and 40 billion euro a year, that is actually a lot of leverage. If a country will have the incentive to pool its defense requirements for the next generation ship or plane or helicopter with a partner country, because that way it will gain access to a sweetener from the defense fund. This could be actually quite powerful. I have a background in the defense industry, and if this had been around when I was in the industry, I would have liked it. Except if I had been an American. Because, in effect, this will work against the American defense industry in Europe. Not because it's protectionist, but because, of course, the inducements are European for European expenditure.
It means that we can also be transactional.
Absolutely. So, Rose, how do you react to that?
Well, again, from an institutional perspective, it was interesting for me being in Prague with Federica on Friday, and also hearing from President Juncker, who used a talking point that Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary of NATO, has also frequently used, saying it's extraordinary that somehow there are over a dozen different kinds of battle tanks produced by European defense companies, and somehow the United States can get on with one. So clearly we need some mechanism to effect a greater efficiency and effectiveness among European defense companies. And that's why I very much welcome the fund. I think it's a great idea from a NATO institutional perspective. Jens has said the same thing. We are truly welcoming it as a way. And inside NATO, we've had our own sins to contend with in terms of our commonly funded capabilities. And so we've had to take a good hard look inside NATO about how to tackle some of these problems and get more efficiency and effectiveness. And so we are, I think, going to be in a mutual and I hope mutually beneficial learning loop here as the Defense Fund moves forward into implementation. So we are very supportive of it. As to the U.S. defense industries, I think they can take care of themselves, François.
I agree. I like that answer, by the way. Børge, I'm going to ask you a practical question and a conceptual one. The practical one, which I already hinted at, is what do we do with the Brits, we, the European Union? And I ask you precisely because you are in a non-EU and in NATO situation, have been, never ceased to be, although you had considered joining the EU. There were a couple of referenda which didn't work out. So you have plenty of experience of being in that particular situation. How do you think we should handle, we the EU, should be handling the British case when it comes to security and defense, given your own experience? That's the practical one. I'll ask the conceptual one afterwards.
I think that question also is very interlinked with the other things that we have discussed. Let me first say that I think there are security challenges enough for all of us, both for NATO and the EU. So we have to make sure that we avoid overlapping, because there is a lack of resources on some of the measures that NATO needs to take moving forward. But definitely we also need a stronger EU facing migration. For example, when it comes to cyber, we have to find also division of labor there. We also have to go much deeper when it comes to violent extremism and dealing with radicalized Islam. When it comes to Britain and this Brexit, we of course should just make sure that we have UK as strongly on board as possible. UK being the strongest military capacity in Europe, if we're not including the Russians, the second largest economy in Europe, even if France is quite close.
Depends on the exchange rate.
Yeah.
Now France is way ahead.
Yeah,
France is way ahead.
I expected you to say so, François. But anyway, we need to make sure that we have the UK on board, and we need them. And also, we know that there is also not full convergence inside the EU on questions like this. UK has been very close, for example, to the Baltic countries, to some of the Visegrad countries, and etc. For me, the way I look at it is that we have a commitment after the Wales summit as a NATO member. We have committed to the 2%. All the NATO members did. Of course, then can discuss if it's 2024 or whatsoever. But more important than that, I think it's in our interest. For me, 2% insurance for a society that has developed in such a prosperous way, what we have built since the Second World War, is worth protecting. So for me, it's an insurance thing that we are, of course, willing to pay. But you know, the picture is much bigger now, as you started out with, François, is that this world order with Bretton Woods, with the EU, with NATO, with the UN, with international law, with human rights, freedom of speech, win-win thinking, not accepting interest squares, Helsinki Act. We're saying that each country has a right to determine its own destiny. This is what we're up to protecting. This win-win recipe we need to continue with. And I believe that there are strong checks and balances in the US. Not underestimate the founding fathers. They're very strategic, and we see that this is in work. And I also, so far, has already worked well with an extremely professional national security team and foreign policy team in the US. That I think we will see good results with them moving forward.
But I don't want to let you go from the British question, which I put to you. And maybe I will give it a slightly different tack, and I'd be very happy if Federica also came in on this.
I was looking forward to the conceptual.
Yeah, but don't worry, it'll come, it'll come. There is talk about creating a permanent structured cooperation on defense within the European Union. Those countries which are the most willing and the most able, this is what the French and the Germans talk a lot about with each other, and others as well. And it is just conceivable that this could be broadened to the UK.
Yes.
Would this be a good idea or a bad idea or an unworkable idea, which is not quite the same thing? And if it were somehow good and workable, would this also be something which would interest Norway?
I think on this question it is, of course, also up to the EU.
Of course, that's why
to answer.
It's safe to let me go first.
Yeah.
Federica, why don't you go first? Yeah.
Couple of minutes.
If I can, a couple of minutes. No, because this is not just a conceptual issue. This is in the treaties.
Yes, sure.
First of all, it's not just a French-German discussion. It's an institutionalized work we have started exactly in September last year at 28, still with the UK in. And we have already agreed at 28 on the governance of a permanent structured cooperation, constituted in 2 layers. One where all member states willing to be in will be, most probably 27. And another one where only member states running concrete projects that can go from producing a drone together to working on cybersecurity will be part of. But this is a provision of the treaty that is foreseen for member states. Then we can have all the most excellent coordination and cooperation with non-member states, as we do have excellent coordination and cooperation with Norway on security and defense, but the permanent structured cooperation is for member states. That is what the treaties are saying, and we're not changing the treaties. So sorry, but I thought it was useful to have this sort of a little bit legalistic disclaimer, but the president tells me being legalistic sometimes is fine. Having said that, on the UK, we're looking for the best possible cooperation afterwards. But let me tell you, the UK is currently contributing to the European Union missions and operations with a contribution between the 3 and 5%. So as Rose was saying, the US industry will survive in any case. I guess the European Union missions and operations will survive also without the 3% of contribution from the UK.
Yeah. Børge, any reaction to that, or?
I think that's...
You defer.
Yeah. We are... You know, we work extremely well with the EU. I think there are a few European member states that are so integrated in the European economy as Norway. We also work well on foreign policy issues together, but we do understand as a non-member, we will not be around the table fully. There is, that's also the result of the 2 Norwegian referendums. But my job as a foreign minister of Norway is, of course, to then work as closely with the EU on these issues, because what happens in the EU happens also in Norway. So we rely a lot on a successful EU, and I hope for an even stronger EU, no dealing with migration, handling Schengen, also Euro, reviving economic growth, and all this. But with NATO, it is also the same. NATO wants to create strong partnerships, but there will also always be, of course, a difference between a full member of NATO and a partner of NATO. I guess that's the same for the EU.
Now let me ask you the conceptual question, and then I'll turn towards the room, towards the floor. When one crafts a security and defense policy, one balances several factors. One is the analysis of the threat situation, very classical. The second one is the level of our ambitions. What are we trying to do? And the third one is, well, do we trust in our alliance system? Now, if I take these three, the threat situation, oh, we have Putin in the East, revisionist agenda. I have a rather negative and dismal reading of Russian policy and intentions, but I also note that Russia has the GDP of Spain, which means that there are limits to the amount of nuisance that they can represent. We, of course, have the jihadi threat. We have the horrors of the Middle East visiting us. You mentioned also the migration issue. But terrorism is not a new thing. 9/11 and Madrid and Beslan and London happened, London 2005, happened a long time before Daesh ever existed. And in some ways was actually worse. So not tremendously new. And of course we have China's rise, which may be an issue of immense concern for the world, but Europe is not in the cockpit, if I could put it that way. Our ambitions. Well, the West used to be very ambitious. The epitome, the apex of ambition was probably trying to impose a Western order in Iraq in 2003. We have retreated from that. And some would argue, I think rightly, that this may have been the more sensible thing to do. So our ambitions are arguably less than they used to be. And there remains the question of our alliances. So when you are sitting at your, when you stop sitting at your desk, because of course, as long as you're at your desk, emergencies, trouble, which you have to shoot on an immediate basis, and meetings at which you have to deal with specific issues. But when you actually leave your desk and you start looking a little bit from beyond the immediate issues, what is your hierarchy of concerns when it comes to why should Europe be developing a security and defense policy? It sounds like it's a very broad, it's a very general question, yes, but I think it's very real, actually.
And it is a crucial question, an existential question. To be honest, for the first time in my political life, I have been the last years worried that some parts of our history could be repeated in the future. It is not like history repeats itself in the same way, but the farther backward you can look, the farther forward you're likely to see. And we have now seen the institutions and the bulwark we build against those forces being questioned. I was more concerned some months ago when it came to Europe, because the elections in the Netherlands and also in France has sent we see some silver linings. But I think we only have seen the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the complexities of the UK leaving Europe. I think we have not really wanted to internalize when such a big economy is using its best brains, and the EU also has to do this to figure this out. And you already mentioned the security aspect of it. We also have Turkey. Is Turkey like choosing a Sonderweg, or is now Erdogan again more serious about approaching Europe? And we had Syria, but we also have we have Egypt, 95 million people. Half of them are illiterate. If that country comes into play, it will also be very challenging for Europe. We have a new administration in the US that we are in a constant dialogue with them to reassure their commitment to these institutions. We know that our wealth is built also on the fact that we are trading with each other. The single market is a good example of what we get from trading, but also trading builds friendships. And we have, since Second World War, established an ecosystem of friends together with the US that are sharing these very important values. And for me, I see protectionism, nationalism, and populism being like very easy answers to very complex questions. As I said earlier today too, that is a toxic cocktail that we definitely should not drink. And I think we have to be more assertive against these forces moving forward, because it is so much at stake. And there are many of the other countries that you mentioned that that naturally will be more inclined to think in interest sphere way. These countries are close to them, so then they also have to have us as a center. And this is nothing that we can accept. So today, we still are not out of the woods, to put it that way. We are at a very important time in history where Europe, not only on the security side, has to take more responsibility, but for the time being, we have to stand up for free trade. We have to stand up for a strong UN and rules-based world order. And we have to stand up for the Paris Agreement when it comes to climate. So we have to take this responsibility in a situation where we just recently have seen the European economy reviving. And this is, of course, good, but there are a lot of challenges when it comes to our competitiveness.
I fear that you're right. Thank you very much indeed. Now I turn towards the audience. I will take a round of three. When I call on you, please identify yourself, because I do not know everybody in the room. And also, of course, if you address your question to one person specifically, please say so. Sir, you over there, and then over there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
There is a microphone, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have studied this paper, Future of European Defence, which came out a few days ago. And the shortest chapter there is The Way Forward. It's about 10 normal lines. And the main question is how quick the member states want to build genuine European security and defense union. This is exactly from this text. We know that the Council of Europe is going to meet still this month and discuss defense matters. May I ask you, Madam Mogherini, that how do you see this meeting? What will be discussed and what can we expect from that meeting? Thank you.
Could you identify yourself? I'm sorry.
My name is Pertti Salolainen. I'm the Vice Chair of the Foreign Affairs of the Parliament.
Excellent. Thank you very much. The other person, yes?
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. President, for also remembering us, younger generation, in these future-themed Kulturalta talks, indeed. My name is Tuomas Tikkanen. I'm the President of Young European Movement Eurooppa Nuoret in Finland, also known as Young European Federalists in Finland. And I'm a federalist myself, and I believe in the common future of the European Union and the common future of Finland in the EU. And I believe that many Finns, vast majority of Finns also believe in this, and especially the youth. So my ultimate question is to High Representative Mogherini, if the EU wants to be a complete union, how does it deal with its responsibility in protecting the union also by military means, ultimately? And also, how do you see the possibility of multi-speed Europe in defense and security, as well as how does the EU-NATO framework work along with non-NATO EU members, such as Finland? Thank you much.
Thank you very much indeed. Do I see a third hand at this stage? Yes, I do. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Erkki Tuomioja, Member of Parliament. The European Union has to be a community of values if it is to be anything. It is obviously also a community of interests, and we have to build on that. But I would like to ask about the Transatlantic Partnership. I think Børge was in on that in a very pertinent way, because can we really talk about a transatlantic partnership of values? We have a partnership of interest, yes. But if Europe is to be anything, it has to be also very clear on its values, as you, Børge, were, when one half of America, the Republican half, is challenging them. And it's actually not only Trump, he's an added complication, but it's the Republican half of America. So I wouldn't want to see us let down the Democratic majority, actually, who did not vote for Trump, by remaining too silent on these issues of values, because these are also very much a security issue as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll now turn back to the panel. Others will have their chance afterwards. Don't worry. Maybe Federica Mogherini first, and then Rose and Børge.
Good, thanks. First of all, on the values, I fully share. Values and interests for us Europeans are on the same side, because we know very well that if you don't invest in human rights, if you don't invest in open societies, you have fragile systems. That has an impact also on security. That's why I'm saying for us, security is never military alone. It's also rule of law, human rights, open societies, and strong systems. Not strong men so much, but strong societies and systems and institutions. That's why we work so much on that aspect. So I'm fully with you on that. On the purely defense-related questions, both of them. One is about the present of the work we're doing on European defense. We have done, I was saying probably before, we've done more in the last 10 months on European defense than we've done in the last 10, 15, actually sometimes I think 60 years. I just tell you a few things we've done last week, the week that is concluding today. On Monday, I was in Mali announcing that the European Union is the first to support with 50 million euros the joint military force that the 5 countries in the Sahel are establishing to fight terrorism and human trafficking across the Sahel. Concretely supporting with a military aimed support our partners to have a work cross-border in their region that has a direct impact on our security across the Mediterranean and in Europe. That happened on Monday. On Tuesday, we sent jointly, Jens Stoltenberg and myself, a report to our respective councils, the NATO allies and the European Union member states, on the implementation of 42 concrete actions that NATO and the European Union have put together in action this last 6 months. And we will discuss this, as Rose was saying, in the Foreign Affairs Council in a week from now, and then in the NATO Defense Ministerial at the end of the month. This to say that there are 42, and out of these 42, 10 are about hybrid threats. And by the way, I'm thankful for the hybrid center that is being established in Helsinki. I'm grateful for the Finnish leadership in this. So 42 concrete actions that EU and NATO have put in place in this last 6 months. Just 2 years ago, this would have been unthinkable in terms of cooperation. On Wednesday, we didn't simply discuss the European Defence Fund. We took the formal decision to establish it, including some budgetary allocations, including for the next 5 years, which is something quite irritual in the European Union decision-making process, with concrete money allocated to support common European research and common European production of capabilities in the military field, which is the basis for developing a research sector and a common industrial basis for the European Union on defense, which is what we were discussing before in terms of creating the solid basis for acting together. The day after, we established for the very first time in European history, this was quite historical, it's a military planning and conduct capability. Said in normal terms, it's for the first time a unique center of planning and command based in Brussels, led by an excellent Finnish general, by the way, that has the overall responsibility for the European Union military training missions. This to say, I do not use the word headquarters, but it's a permanent military structures based in Brussels that has the unique responsibility of planning and conducting the operations we have. Just a few weeks ago, people were telling me, forget it, it's never going to happen. And the very same day, we inaugurated in Spain, in Zaragoza, a training center, one training center for all European Union military forces, air forces, to train together. Up to now, if our air crews wanted to be trained together, had to go to the United States to do it. Now I imagine that even for the United States, this could be convenient to train in Europe if their forces are in Europe. This to say that if you take just a few days, a week of work on European defense, what the President was saying, it's concrete steps, it's in the making. The way forward. First of all, maybe I'm too pragmatic in this, maybe I'm not so much from the south, I'm a bit Nordic, if you allow me. I'm very much interested in the way forward. But I think the way forward is determined by the steps that concretely we manage to make today. We've spent 60 years discussing the way forward and the future of European defense, and we didn't move one single step. Today, if we manage to put one after the other these concrete decisions that are shaping today, in this week, in the coming weeks, the European defense institutions and capabilities, this is going to bring us to the future. This is maybe why the part of the paper on the way forward is relatively short compared to the rest, because all the previous paragraphs and chapters are very much detailed with things that are not for the future. Some of those things that you will find in the paper might happen in 3 months from now. And when we think about the way forward, is the way forward 10, 15, 20 years from now? I can tell you, I believe that we can establish a permanent structured cooperation, the multi-speed way to work on European defense, by the end of this year. It cannot be the case. It's a decision that member states will have to take, but I believe this is realistic to think. As I thought it was realistic to establish a military command and control capability in Brussels, in our military structures, because it's what we need. So I see the conditions to move forward in a very determined way, in a non-conflictual way, in a cooperative way together with NATO and with our partners around the world, and to do it in a concrete manner. But also with a little bit of, if I can say, wisdom. Again, I stress here, there's a European way to security. The military and the defense part of it is a very important one. But if I can make a comment, François, on what you said before, a personal opinion. I don't think that the idea of exporting democracy, for instance, in Iraq, was having high ambitions. I think it was being arrogant.
Yeah, of course.
And in ancient Greece, the hubris was one of the most terrible sins you could have, because it puts you in a very difficult place. I think today what we have understood is that, first of all, do no harm. First of all, read the complexity you have around you. First of all, understand that the African forces are the best positioned to fight terrorism in their own territory and try to support them in their own way. Ownership, partnership, cooperation. At the end of the day, this is what has made the Europeans. And this is what we should use a bit more. So I think that, yes, we will move forward on defense and security, including on the military side. I'm convinced, and I hope that we will not do it giving up to our own way of doing security, which is, by the way, the most successful way that history has known so far, and that the world in this moment needs a little bit more than ever before.
Well, thank you. I couldn't agree more on hubris, by the way. Rose, over to you.
All right, very good. I wanted to Sir, just question your hypothesis. I'm taking off my institutional hat again and now speaking as an American. There have been several comments today. I'll come back to one François made as well as we're wrapping up here. But I really know a lot of Republicans across the party, and I cannot think that they could be accused of setting aside basic values. So I want to caution us all about making broad generalizations at a time that is admittedly quite difficult in the American political environment. But even reportedly within the president's own family, there was disagreement as to how to proceed with Paris. And certainly within his cabinet, we know there was disagreement as to how to proceed with Paris. So to say that during the current administration, Republican administration in Washington, somehow all values are being set aside for good and forever, I think we have to be cautious about that type of thing. And I think, again, I want to come back to Minister Brende's comment about the institutions in the United States. We need to, I think, watch carefully now as to how those institutions perform under Republican leadership. Both the Congress, with their investigations going on, and I'm sure many of you were watching the hearing with Mr. Comey the other day. I think we also have to watch how our judiciary performs in the various investigations that are going on, and see just how strong the institutions will be. I believe, as an American, I believe that they will be strong. And it's not just a hope, it's a strongly held belief, I'll say even conviction, that they will be strong. Now, the second point I want to come back to, François, in case I don't get another bite at it, is your opening hypothesis about the weakening alliance. I just wanted us all to consider once again how much concern was reeling around Europe during the Obama administration's pivot to Asia just a few years ago, when there was real concern emanating from Brussels that real military capability was going to be removed, the Americans were going to take it and move it to Asia. And there was a very, very strong concern about the impact that that would have on NATO. Today, I see actually a different effect that began in the U.S. response, again, to the seizure of Ukrainian territory by Russia in Crimea back in 2014, and that was a very full-throated U.S. response through the European Reassurance Initiative. And even here, the Trump administration has put an extra $1.4 billion in the FY18 defense budget into the European Reassurance Initiative. That's money, but also I see the presence of U.S. troops on the ground, not only in the heavy brigade that is being deployed, but in the battle groups, where we, as the United States, will have so-called heel-to-toe deployments going on, again, in fulfillment of commitments and requirements under the NATO aegis. I think it's important to bear these kinds of concrete developments in mind as we are in the midst of, yes, admittedly, a very, very difficult and in some ways uncertain environment with Washington. So the last comment I've been making quite frequently in recent days is, let's bear in mind the actions, because actions speak louder than words.
Thank you very much, Børge.
Thank you. I second what Federica said about hubris, but in addition, we should, of course, avoid that. But in addition, we need a big portion of humbleness. Of course, we are seeing that our close ally and friend, the US, is having challenges currently. But we cannot avoid also admitting that also inside the EU, there is challenges when it comes to values. We talk now about the US, but Federica, in the Visegrad countries, we know you can probably comment on what we're seeing now unfolding in Poland, Hungary, and some other of these countries. I think we're going to handle it well, because the institutions are so strong and we will overcome this, but we should not be complacent about this. We have the whole West Balkans, we have the Brexit thing that we have to handle. Of course, the US is now in a situation that is very, very complex, and we have to follow it. But for me, this is not, and I think Erkki has a point about interest and values, but when it comes, I also would like to add permanent friends and permanent interest. And for me, when I go to Washington, D.C. and sit in the office of John McCain or Lindsey Graham, with John, I feel it's a permanent friend. I feel that in Washington, D.C., there are so many checks and balances, and we still have some of our most important supporters of a liberal world order. But then, of course, we are having some of the same challenges here in Europe, and I think only if we work well together, the US and Europe, we are at our strongest. And I think this is also part of the Nordic cooperation. We don't only have permanent interest, but I feel coming to Helsinki, coming to Stockholm, Copenhagen, and Reykjavik, it's about permanent friends that always are there if there are difficulties, even if it's challenges for yourself to step up. This is what this is about.
It's good to hear that the Nordics are not transactional. I think that's actually a great moment. We have time for two quick questions. I have recognized you, sir, and you over there. So you go ahead first.
Good evening. My name is Matti Posio. I'm a newspaper editor for Finland's Land and Media. Ms. Mogherini, if I may, I would like you to touch upon two things about European integration today. First, a happy one, good news from the border between Poland and Ukraine. The Ode for Joy was played there last night, and Ukrainians have come for the first day ever with no visas to the European Union, and also to my hometown Tampere today to play against Finland in soccer. I hope they lose, but they played the European anthem. So how do you see a way forward for widening European Union to the member states, or the wannabe member states who stand below European flags? And another question, briefly, do you think the threat of right-wing leaning Brexiteer type parties is over in Finland, or are you worried about it? I mean, Le Pen is not the president of France, but is that enough? Thank you.
You over there. Microphone over here.
Thank you. My name is Pekka Haavisto, Member of Parliament, and I also have two very short questions. First is to Madame Mogherini and linked actually this European enlargement, because when you go to Macedonia or Kosovo or Serbia, there are people eagerly expecting to join us and thinking that European Union can solve their both economic and security problems. And of course this area is a little bit in the shadow now because there are so many other problems currently, but what could we do with them and how to help that process? And then my second question is to my friend Børge on Nordic cooperation, since you mentioned it, that when we in Finland speak about the Nordic cooperation and Nordic security and defense, it's actually very often then limited to the Finnish-Swedish cooperation between Finland and Sweden, and of course because we have different choices with Norway on EU and NATO and so forth. But do you see something deepening cooperation between Norway and Finland on security matters in the future?
Thank you very much. So, answers and closing remarks. Federica, why don't you go first?
First of all, one of the golden rules I try to respect is never to comment on domestic politics. This is one of the rules I will not break. I do it for my own country. Imagine if I would do it for other countries. But I would make a general consideration about what you called extreme right forces, what I call anti-system forces, because in some cases it's extreme right, in some other cases it's anti-system proper. What I'm actually seeing around Europe, and first of all, I see that they do not exist only in Europe. You broaden the picture a little bit and you see that there is an anti-system temptation around the world that I think, I was saying this during our press conference earlier today, I think are related to the way in which representative democracy works. I think we've entered into a stage of politics in the world where the level of representation and links between the citizen and the institutions at all levels needs to be rethought. So what we perceive normally as anti-European forces sometimes are also forces that put into question the representation or the effectiveness of institutions at national or regional or local level. And if you look at the polls, at the opinion polls, sometimes you find out that public opinions do not express higher support for national institutions than for European institutions. In some cases, in some months, the support or the trust in European institutions is higher than the trust in national or local institutions. This to say, I believe we have to reflect deeply on how we represent our citizens and how we give answers to the needs of our populations. But are we sure that these forces are on the rise? Because if you look around the results, not of the polls, but of the real elections, my sense is that these forces are losing ground recently. UKIP didn't get even one single seat in the British Parliament, if I'm not wrong. Marine Le Pen didn't win. She got a remarkable amount of votes in the system, but France has a president that is the only candidate that made a campaign out of being a proud European in France. Quite remarkable. In the Netherlands, you have seen a shift. And I could go on in Austria with the presidential elections at the end of the year. So are we sure that the wind is blowing in that direction? Or isn't it true that what sounds attractive in public speeches then doesn't look that much attractive when it turns into real policies? It's a question I leave open. But I see a certain reflection, a certain counter movement of realizing that these narratives turned into real policies might be dangerous for our societies. That's my sense, but I might be wrong. On visa liberalization for Ukraine, indeed a good news. I don't know about the football match, but all my sympathy. Football is a very sensitive issue for any Italian, so you have all my understanding. But it's indeed a very good news, and I'm very glad that we managed to achieve that. This is the most tangible thing that Ukrainian citizens can see in terms of being together. with the European Union. When it comes to new member states, I turn to the Balkans. And this is also somehow an answer to your question, to that part of your question. When we talk about, and this is a personal but also political answer, when we talk about the future of the European Union, we don't talk about a future at 27. We talk about a future with new member states. Will it be in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, in 15 years' time? It depends on the pace of reforms and negotiations we are engaged in. But I can tell you, it's not the Balkans, it's not only the Balkans needing to come in the Union, it's also us that need the Balkans to come in. When we had the major Syria refugee crisis 1.5 years ago, where did we turn to cooperate together to manage the borders in the Balkans? We turned to, together, member states and non-member states. And I can tell you, some of the non-member states were extremely cooperative and saved some of the member states. When we talk about security, who do we turn to when it comes to the radicalization in the Balkans? To the authorities of those countries that are not member states yet, and maybe have not even started. This to say, and look at numbers of the economic links that are there between the Western Balkans and the rest of the European Union. Our economies are interconnected. So when it comes to security, when it comes to peace, because it's only 20 years ago, only 20 years ago is nothing that we're facing war in Europe. When it comes to security, when it comes to peace, when it comes to stability, and when it comes also to economic integration, we are one. And we will have, if negotiations goes well and if reforms go in the right direction, we will have new member states coming from the Balkans. This is in our interest as well. And if you look at the numbers of popular support and trust in the populations in the Western Balkans towards the European Union institutions, they are around 70–80%. And it's a population that brings to our talks, our policymaking, an energy and a determination to be truly European that is quite remarkable and can be extremely helpful also for the European Union as such. No time framework can be set, but the sense of direction is clear. And I see in the region a commitment, a determination, a new generation of leaders with all the limits and all the history coming up again from time to time that is quite unique. So I believe that this is going to be one of the chantier, how do you say it in English, that is going to bring us good satisfactions.
Thank you. Børge, your closing views and responses also to the questions.
Thank you, François, and again, thank you to President Niinistö for bringing us all together here. For me, it's also very good to be here at the 100th anniversary of a free Finland. We had this celebration also in Norway some years ago. We have 112 years since we broke the union with Sweden in 1905. At that time, we were the poorest country in Europe, together with Iceland and Ireland. 1/3 of the Norwegian population left for the United States. So today, the Nordic countries are not doing that badly. I think our societies that are quite egalitarian, inclusive, and also inspire other countries, and we try to also be constructive, both in NATO and in the EU. But and this is the basis also for all my political work, is that I know that the reason why my country has grown out of poverty and all children go to school and we have a good healthcare system is based on what we built after the Second World War. European Union started with coal and steel union. We joined NATO in 1949. We saw the UN established. We saw international law. We got the WTO after GATS. All this ecosystem of ways of dealing with each other in a very organized and civilized way is what we have to protect and fight for in the coming years. And it is more challenged than it has been for a long time. And I think having a discussion about these values and interests at the 100th anniversary of Finland is something very important. And that's why I also can say to my friend Pekka that we, from Norway's side, would like to deepen and enlarge also the security and defense cooperation, not only with Finland, but also with Sweden and in the Nordic context. This is not a challenge for NATO or the EU that we come together and do more here. Is a win-win thing. This was more challenging during the Cold War. Today I can see no downside of it, really. I only see a win-win. So this is something that we will also follow up in the coming years. And we know that Syria is on the border of NATO. Libya is on the other side of the Mediterranean. And our people also expect us to deal with these challenges moving forward. And we can only deal with this if we stand together as Europe. And we cannot, and that was my last point, we cannot anymore expect that someone else comes and fix all our challenges. We had to fix the euro ourselves. We had to fix the Schengen, not perfect yet, but we also have to then fix a lot of other challenges together and stick together. I think that's that is crucial moving forward.
Thank you very much, Rose.
Just very quickly, I also wanted to talk about NATO enlargement because we just had a very happy event this week in that we welcomed Montenegro Montenegro as a new member of NATO on Monday in Washington, and on Wednesday with the raising of Montenegro's flag at NATO headquarters and also at our commands. So I did want to say that I'll return to the point I made at the outset, these two great institutions, the EU and NATO, do have a role to play, a very important role in the future of Europe by leaving their doors open. And that is a very important principle for NATO as well, the open door policy. I think it lends both momentum and also structure to the aspirations of countries around the European region. And I think it's important to stress both that principle and the principle where NATO is concerned that countries must be able to choose their security relationships for themselves. So with that, I will say that among those countries that we are hoping to work with increasing momentum in coming years is the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, as well as, of course, Bosnia and Herzegovina. But those will be efforts that will require a lot of work, both on the part of those countries and on the part of the NATO institutions. So thank you for this opportunity once again. Thank you, Mr. President. It's been a pleasure from my perspective to be here tonight as well.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you also for having drawn, as well as Federica did, our discussion towards the end also on the Balkans, which are actually entering into a new phase of crisis, which is going to cause us a lot of problems in the near future, and we have to watch carefully. I'm not going to try to summarize our discussion, all because you remember it perfectly. And also we are in a few seconds going to be called to have some drinks and partake of Finnish hospitality. But I would want to line up a few takeaways from our discussion, very briefly. First of all, Federica, you reminded us that a lot is happening in terms of European security and defense. Ever since Brexit began, there's been a new energy pumped into the system, and that energy has been redoubled by the advent of Mr. Trump. The future, in a way, is happening now. There has been a lot of disappointment over the last 25 years in this field. And like others, I'm a little bit like St. Thomas. I want to see the hands and the place where the nails were. But yes, things are happening. Secondly, Rose, you reminded us that the real cutoff point, the starting point for where we are, is 2014, the change of the threat situation, and that we must not forget. It's actually not simply a chronological consideration, it's a very basic and important consideration. Børge, you, in response to my conceptual question, you came up with a very interesting list, and which I would want us to ponder. It's one of the things to take away. The difficulties of the British issue. We have only begun to grapple with that particular issue. Europe's history has been intertwined with that of the United Kingdom and England before it for the last 8 centuries. And there is no way that Brexit can be something simple and easy to handle. It's going to be very, very long and complicated, and Turkey and protectionism and migration, which you put in the list. And Federica, thank you so much. I say this as a Frenchman. It is great to see that you can win an election by being a proud European. That, you know, if 2 years ago somebody had said you will be in mass rallies with 20,000 people waving European flags and stomping their feet while saying Europe, Europe, and they said, no, come on, you know, this is not the wave that we're going through. We're going through the populist wave. Yes, dear politicians who are here, you can win an election by being a proud European. That is a very big takeaway. And lastly, Børge, if you had been speaking in Italian, and if one would summarize in one sentence what you are saying to us at the end, that Europa farà da sé, Europe will build itself. Thank you for the 3 of you. Thank you for all of you in the room. Thank you, Mr. President. This has been a great occasion, and I understand that we're going to continue with that occasion in a more relaxed manner. Thank you, Finland. This is a great country. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Monsieur HEISBOURG. It was a fantastic discussion.